two, one, go. The preservation of art is not only tied to the beauty and the aesthetic value of it or the means that we're going to be able to share it to the world. It is tied to the community. It is tied to the artists who did those pieces of art. What is the most important thing in this debate? It's the strategy of prioritization. What we do on opposition that government doesn't understand is shifting the incentives of the state to actually protect these cultural heritage spots instead of taking from them more and potentially displacing them. A few floating responses at the top of my speech before I move on to my extensions. First, Deputy Prime Minister generalizes the audience of art as anyone and everyone. Inasmuch as this in a vacuum is true, we need to understand the deeper reasons and motivations why an artist made a particular form of art. On both sides, people are free to go and see that art, but on side up, there is a more deliberate purpose and reason when you go to a certain area. Even if this is not going to last forever, the limited viewability and access in and of itself give art meaning. The finality of art in itself allows people to not take it for granted and see it as tokenistic. More on that in my extension later. Second, government assumes the universal access for art. But in many instances, art pieces are expressions of dissent and adversity. The depictions of war, revolution, violence, and blood serve as a countervailing artifact to challenge structural limitations. On-site government, if you move these to predominantly white or Western institutions, or even in like developing countries, just decentralized cities, sure, there might be safe materially, but bastardizes the intent of that art. Third, side government reinforces a modern day sense of neo-colonialism when they whitewash the cultures, races, and identities of people and their cultures in the same vein of preservation. This is a principled and practical push to their assertion of the material quality being the same as the visceral experience of that art, even if it is damaged or at worst no longer around. Not to little no response to the framing and argumentation by Kuya Yosef, a clear lack of engagement. At best, what you get from government is a synthetic and artificial reconstruction or preservation of that art. The kicker is make a new kind of art as a response to this or a replica if you really want to preserve it. Do not disgrace the entire artists and their communities by culturally appropriating their art in the name of moral integrity. And lastly, they have this idea of like the discourse on the injustice and the oppression of these communities for the museum, but it is laughable. First, who the hell visits these museums? Couples on dates, tourists, people who want to collect place spots to like go to have a good time. Second, why is the original version of the art likely reinterpreted opposing the original? A colonizer will not just let visitors know they colonized the people they stole their art from. More on that later. Third, what is the presentation in these museums? They have a guide that provides a curated experience based on the catharsis for these aesthetics that the owners of the museums decide. But compare that to communities who can still do it, but just who are more familiar with that art, right? Now, go check this chair. What should the state do when they find out that an area is high risk relative to the fact that there's art in these? Government says that let's preserve this art because this should not be gatekept. This should be something that should be shown to the world. Their priority is the art to be shown to the world instead of the actual community there. Second, we say that we preserve this by taking that risk head on and improving the infrastructures there, helping the communities, the people living there. Governments put the dirt under the rug, we clean it whole. Just on the basis of the value judgment for these two choices, we already win just because we nuance it to the actual artists in those areas. Second piece of extension, how does this material integrity actually happen historically, right? Though we did have an agreement when it comes to like the colonization of like white people here, right? But the reason this metric is important is because it deals with the true processes behind the preservation of these arts. These are going to be likely ethnic artists that are going to be entitled to having their works to be in the community, as what Kuya Yosef explained. There are ethnic tensions in these areas where the victors are going to be the ones who are going to be more centralized. They are likely the oppressors, colonizers that government conceded to, right? This looks like UK taking away a lot of Native American art pieces for the British Museum. They're less likely for Native Americans to expand their culture or remember it because they need to go to UK. The continuous prioritization of material integrity is the preservation of the stealing of art from these indigenous communities by these colonizers. Let's be charitable and say that the state is likely to represent this thing well and just not for aesthetics. It's still far from their community to begin with. Now then, let's go on to the median case on how does this material integrity happen domestically. Let's assume that those types of foreign colonization doesn't happen. It's pretty much the same, but let's nuance it further. Sure, things like capital cities are able to get the national arts from like to the national museums through the ethnic arts from like all over the country. For example, like indigenous communities, right? But in the best case, centralization of these arts to the most well protected areas is still going to happen. This is bad because once again, it takes away those art from their places without even pushing the state to give importance to these ethnic and indigenous communities to begin with. With these communities historically being oppressed and zoned out, their experiences are tied to the art that they give. Moreover, their lands are sacred to them. To illustrate this, let's say that in a rural mountain with a bunch of ethnic tribes making arts like pottery, statues of tribal leaders, paintings, etc., are likely to not have too much money. But at the time the state finds out that those areas are in danger and they're like Lumads, Etas, Mori, etc., material integrity pushes the state to take their art away from them and even displace them, which goes against the principle of these indigenous communities. The comparative is simple. It exacerbates the further displacement of these communities because the land was recognized to be in danger in the first place. The government's nuance is just, oh, this art is important to be preserved. But who made these pieces of art? Who made sure to make these pieces of art important in the first place? Second, on the comparative, how do we address all these problems? First, in developing countries, states are now more incentivized to build heritage spots, allowing for a culture-rich area. Second, just because it is an area that is high of danger doesn't mean that it will be destroyed immediately, precisely because these areas are in danger, because there are people living in it. The states won't just go, oh, let's transfer this art, because they're going to be even more unpopular among those communities. And last extension, on tourism. The reason that this is important is because if government would like to involve people outside of those specific communities, let's see how they're able to connect more to those arts. At the same time, two birds, one stone, state incentives for economic growth. States are able to maximize economic contributions from tourism because the many cultural spots pushes for these tourists to travel all over the country, getting to know these different cultures in the first place. This is true for two reasons. First, they have limited time in the country, they want to have fun. Second, they just want to maximize the amount of photos that they're going to have. And sure, they still get on their side of the house with things like the national museums and even regional ones in the best case. The problem is that they go to those museums run by corporate shills with security guards doing a 9 to 5 or an overnight shift and a bunch of other people who's just there to take photos. So even that economic benefits are symmetrical, the way tourism differs on our side is just a more well-meaning connection. This ironically flips this idea of these communities being selfish with their art because the state now actively promotes those cultural heritage spots because they earn from tourism. They gain the good side of those indigenous communities, etc. On their side, they gain the favor of other people without respecting the value or of honoring those communities first. We force the state to prioritize and look at the preservation, not just from the lens of do we have it here with us, but rather how do we empower the communities that erected these in the first place. Oppose.